Should you go Team Blue or Team Red? Well, there's all these options out there.
Some Q1 2026 CPU market data suggests that Intel might be losing its stranglehold. AMD's server CPU revenue share just hit a record 46.2%. Its client CPU unit share climbed to 29.6%, up from 24.1% the same quarter a year earlier. Its mobile CPU unit share hit an all-time high of 28.3%. This is not a slow shift happening in the background. This is a sustained, multi-year erosion, and it is accelerating right as AI infrastructure spending explodes, which is exactly the moment Intel could least afford to be losing ground. To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to understand what Intel actually was to the industry.
But if you're sitting at home on an AM5 system and you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is so much better, I should rush out and buy this thing, maybe hold your horses. If you're already on a Z890 board, go for it. Have fun, go forth and prosper. This is in your upgrade path.
It was never loved, exactly. Nobody had an Intel poster on their wall. Nobody felt emotional about the little chime that used to play when a PC booted up. But Intel had something more powerful than love. It had inevitability. For nearly 30 years, if you were buying a serious business laptop, building a server rack, or specifying a data center order, Intel was the default answer, not because people were excited about it, but because nobody got fired for choosing Intel. It worked. It was everywhere. It was predictable. That predictability was built on something specific. Intel controlled its own manufacturing. Design and fabrication under one roof meant Intel could promise a roadmap and actually hit it, year after year, while rivals depended on outside foundries and got squeezed by someone else's priorities. That vertical integration was the moat. And that is exactly what makes what has happened over the past several years so uncomfortable for Intel's leadership to sit with. Go back further, and the contrast gets sharper. In the mid-2000s and through most of the 2010s, AMD was treated as an afterthought in server conversations, holding a share of that market that was essentially rounding error small. Enterprise buyers weren't ignoring AMD out of stubbornness. They were making a rational bet on the company with the more dependable roadmap. For most of that period, that company was clearly Intel. Somewhere in the last decade, the manufacturing advantage flipped. Intel's newer process nodes ran into repeated delays. Sapphire Rapids Xeon chips arrived late and with well-documented issues, right as customers were making long-term purchasing decisions for the data center.
Now, I don't know this for sure, so take this with a grain of salt, but to me, this seems like Intel knows that their chips are running louder, hotter, and less efficiently. So they give money to these companies to force them into using them instead of AMD. And this really sucks.
Meanwhile, AMD, fabricating through TSMC, kept shipping on schedule. That single reversal mattered more than almost anything else in this story, because it is the thing Intel's entire reputation was built on. Reliability was the product. When the reliability slipped, customers who had never seriously evaluated an alternative suddenly had a reason to. By late 2022, AMD had crossed the 20% mark in server CPU unit share, and Intel dropped under 75% for the first time in years. That was the early tremor. What's happened since is the full shift. Analysts tracking the space have been blunt about it. Looking back at Q2 2023, AMD's server CPU revenue share sat at just 25.1%. Reaching over 46% from there in under 3 years means AMD has been growing its share of the x86 server market by something like 7% annually, a pace that's genuinely rare for an established, mature hardware category where market leaders usually only lose ground a point or two at a time. Some projections now put AMD's server revenue share approaching 40% by 2027, with Intel potentially dropping below half the market for the first time since the category existed in its modern form. There's also a third competitor complicating things further: ARM-based server chips, championed heavily by hyperscale cloud providers chasing better performance per watt, are carving out a growing slice of the same pie. Forecast by some analysts to reach somewhere around 9 to 12% of CPU revenue in the coming years. That means Intel isn't just fighting AMD for the remaining share, it's fighting a two-front war, against a resurgent direct competitor on one side and an entirely different chip architecture on the other, in the exact market segment that generates its highest margins. According to Mercury Research, AMD's server processor unit share reached 33.2% in Q1 2026, up from 28.8% the previous quarter and 27.2% a year earlier. Intel still ships the majority of server CPUs at 66.8%, but watch that number over time and the direction is unmistakable. The revenue numbers are more dramatic still. AMD's server CPU revenue share hit 46.2%, a record. That means AMD now captures close to half of every dollar spent on x86 server CPUs, while shipping roughly a third of total units. That gap is not a fluke. It reflects AMD's high core count EPYC chips, carrying a real premium over Intel's Xeon lineup. And it means AMD isn't winning on cheap volume in the low-margin segment. It's winning in the part of the market that actually generates profit. Client CPUs tell a similar story. AMD's unit share in that segment rose to 29.6% in Q1 2026, up from 29.2% the previous quarter, and sharply higher than 24.1% a year prior. Intel still controls roughly 70% of consumer PC market share, but the trajectory keeps bending the same direction, quarter after quarter, and a trend that consistent stops being noise and starts being a pattern. If there was one category Intel was expected to hold on to no matter what, it was mobile. Business laptops, premium notebooks, the corporate refresh cycle, all of it ran through Intel by default for decades. That fortress has cracks in it now. AMD's mobile CPU unit share climbed to 28.3% in Q1 2026.
Intel seems committed to for its future. But even though both Intel and AMD are trying to break up the classic monolithic chip design, don't expect it to go away completely. These fancy methods of linking chiplets together do cost money.
Its best quarter ever in that category, up from 26% the prior quarter and 22.5% a year earlier. The revenue numbers matter even more here. AMD's mobile CPU revenue share rose to 28.9%. Up from 22.2% just 1 year prior. That climb reflects something specific. AMD isn't just picking up cheap budget laptop wins anymore. It's breaking into the higher-margin premium notebook segment that Intel treated as basically guaranteed income for a generation. Intel still holds the majority of notebook revenue, around 71.7%. But a year earlier that number was 77.5%. 6 points of premium laptop revenue moved to a competitor in 12 months. That is not a rounding error in a company's flagship category. Market share numbers can feel abstract. AMD closed its most recent quarter with revenue up more than 34% year over year, driven by a data center segment that posted record numbers on the back of EPYC server chips and Instinct GPU shipments. Client revenue was up 34% as well. Gaming revenue surged 50%. Across every major category, AMD's numbers moved in one direction. Intel's quarter looked very different. Revenue was down year over year, with a GAAP net loss reported. The Client Computing Group, Intel's largest and historically most dependable segment, actually declined. Intel's data center and AI segment did grow, but only modestly compared to the pace AMD is setting. And Intel Foundry, the manufacturing arm that leadership has repeatedly framed as the company's comeback story, posted another multi-billion-dollar operating loss. That last part deserves attention, because it's the crux of the whole situation. Intel's plan to win back ground depends heavily on its next-generation manufacturing process, Intel 18A, proving itself with external customers. So far, that process remains largely unproven outside Intel's own products, while TSMC, the foundry AMD depends on, keeps delivering on schedule for everyone who uses it, AMD included. Intel's leadership has repeatedly framed the AI infrastructure boom as its opportunity to reset the narrative, a new, fast-growing category where old market share numbers wouldn't matter, and Intel could compete on equal footing. That has not played out the way Intel hoped. AMD has locked in major hyperscale infrastructure commitments, including large multi-gigawatt GPU deployment agreements with big cloud partners and tens of thousands of Instinct accelerators contracted for delivery through major cloud providers. Intel's data center and AI growth, by comparison, has been real but far more modest, arriving from a smaller base and expanding at a noticeably slower pace. The uncomfortable truth for Intel is that the AI boom didn't reset the competition. It just replayed the same dynamic that's been playing out in traditional servers, except with even more capital on the table and even less room for Intel to close the gap through incremental engineering wins. This shift hasn't just been visible to people reading spec sheets and benchmark charts. Investors have been repositioning around it for a while now. AMD's market cap hit an all-time high in the same stretch that Intel's stock climbed to a 25-year high of its own, both riding the broader AI infrastructure wave, but for very different underlying reasons. One on genuine execution and expanding margins, the other largely on speculation about a turnaround that hasn't fully materialized yet in the numbers. Fund managers building portfolios around the semiconductor supply chain have started positioning specifically around AMD's gains rather than Intel's recovery story.
And you're good to go. They also say that the 200S Plus series has early support for 4-rank CU DIMMs, which apparently can pack up to 128 gigabytes per module, which is freaking, like, who's gonna buy, who can buy that? Why can buy that?
Some funds have taken stakes in smaller component suppliers, specifically because of their exposure to AMD's expanding server socket volume, describing it plainly as a bet on AMD's market share gains versus Intel continuing to play out. When capital allocators start building entire investment theses around a single company's ability to keep taking share from the historical category leader, that tells you the shift isn't just a talking point in YouTube comment sections. It's showing up in how professional money is being deployed. None of this means Intel's stock is doomed or that AMD is a guaranteed winner forever. Markets get ahead of themselves in both directions all the time, and Intel still carries assets, government backing, and manufacturing capacity that no competitor can casually replicate. But the direction of capital flow is one more data point stacked on top of everything else, and it's pointing the same way the unit share and revenue share numbers are pointing. Gaming CPUs were another category where Intel's brand recognition used to carry weight almost automatically. That's eroded too, and for reasons that go beyond raw benchmarks. Intel's high-end desktop chips have developed a reputation for extreme power draw, with flagship models pulling well over 250 watts under sustained full-core load. That level of power draw demands serious cooling, large all-in-one liquid coolers or high-end tower air coolers. And even then, thermal throttling shows up in extended workloads like rendering or long gaming sessions. For an enthusiast audience that pays close attention to price to performance and thermal behavior, that reputation sticks and spreads through word of mouth, reviews, and community benchmarking far faster than any marketing campaign can counter it. AMD, meanwhile, has increasingly won the value conversation in exactly this segment. Pricing that undercuts Intel at comparable performance tiers, plus a socket platform that stayed backward compatible across generations, has made AMD the default recommendation in a huge share of PC building communities that used to lean Intel almost by habit. There's an added twist that makes the current moment even more precarious for Intel. The industry is running into genuine supply shortages on the CPU side, driven by explosive server demand. Reports out of the supply chain describe price increases as steep as 3 times normal levels on some x86 chips, as both Intel and AMD prioritize allocation toward the biggest US hyperscale customers, leaving smaller buyers scrambling for capacity. Intel's own next-generation Xeon lineup, codenamed Diamond Rapids, has reportedly seen its mass production timeline slip from the second half of 2026 into the middle of 2027. In a normal market, a supply shortage might actually help the incumbent. Scarcity often reinforces whoever already has the deepest customer relationships and the most entrenched position. But when your competitor is the one setting the pace on both availability and next-generation timelines, a shortage just becomes another mechanism that locks in the leader's advantage rather than protecting the incumbents. Every quarter that Diamond Rapids slips is another quarter hyperscalers spend deepening their AMD deployments instead of waiting around for Intel's answer. Here's the part that should worry Intel's leadership most. The company's public response to all of this has largely been to point at future roadmaps, next-generation nodes, next-generation architectures, next-generation AI accelerators, as the moment things turn around. That framing treats this as a product problem, a gap in specs and timelines that better engineering will eventually close. But the data suggests something more structural is going on. Customers didn't leave because AMD had a flashier feature list in any single quarter. They left because AMD's execution became more predictable than Intel's, at exactly the moment Intel's own execution became less predictable than it had been in decades. That is not a problem solved by winning back a benchmark chart next generation. That is a trust problem, and trust doesn't reset the way a spec sheet does. Making that harder to fix is the interlocking nature of Intel's business. The foundry losses need external customers to offset them, but winning external customers requires a manufacturing track record Intel hasn't rebuilt yet. The data center business needs premium ASPs to compete with AMD's margins, but premium pricing requires the performance credibility AMD currently holds in that segment. Every lever Intel wants to pull is tangled up with another lever that isn't working yet. This shift is starting to reshape decisions outside of Intel and AMD's own quarterly reports. OEMs building enterprise laptops that used to spec Intel almost automatically are now routinely offering AMD configurations in the same product lines, sometimes as the recommended option rather than the budget alternative. Cloud providers are diversifying server fleets in ways that would have seemed unnecessary a decade ago, when Intel's dominance made single-vendor deployments the obvious, low-risk default. Component suppliers up and down the chain, socket manufacturers, motherboard partners, cooling vendors, are adjusting their own product roadmaps around AMD's growing footprint instead of treating it as a niche segment worth an afterthought SKU. None of that happens because of one good product cycle. It happens because procurement teams, IT departments, and hardware partners run multi-year planning cycles, and multi-year planning cycles only shift this dramatically